Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning and welcome to today's session on the course The History of English Language and Literature. Let's begin today's lecture with a short question. I would like to know how many of you can read this following text. Does this look familiar in any way? Is this similar to any of the languages that we currently speak or that we currently are familiar with? Or is it an entirely foreign tongue for you? Let me try and make this a little easier for you. Let's listen to an audio of this text.
Padar ura fuve artan havanum, sea thin namaya hachut, toba koma thin richa, ja wartha thin willa on artan swasma on havanum. Urtna ja dai hamlikan hlaf sele us to dai, an verhif us ura gultas, swaswa we verhivat gultendum, an nalad fu us on kostnunge, akalysus of uvela sothricha.
So if it still does not seem any familiar, let's see what this exactly is. This is a text in Old English, and the text that we currently saw was the Lord's Prayer written in Old English. This is around 1000 AD, and we also saw in some of the first sessions that Old English seemed very different from what the current English looks like. Though it's called as Old English, there's hardly anything English about it, and as we can see over here, this is how we would have talked, and this is how English would have looked like if the English had won the Battle of 1066, if the Norman conquest had a different turn of history, had a different turn of result, then perhaps English would have looked like this. There's a very interesting book by D. Cowley which is titled How We Would Talk If the English Had Won in 1066. This is a matter of intellectual curiosity, and many linguists have considered revising English language along the tenets of Old English tongue, and the strange thing is that it would only look like a very foreign text. It does not have much similarity with the way currently English has been fashioned. So this is the ironic fact about the evolution and emergence of England and English language. The term England is, as we have noted in one of the earlier sessions as well, it's born from the Anglo-Saxons. They were the ones who named the who gave the name to the land. It was England or Angleland, and from there England takes its name. But the ironic fact remains that English language exists only because the Anglo-Saxons did not win against the Normans. We know about the Norman conquest which happened in 1066 AD, and we also know that the Normans had won over the Anglo-Saxons, and there was very little trace of Anglo-Saxon life from then onwards. And however, this failure marks the beginning of the emergence of English language in the form that we see it today. So this is a story of this kind, the story that we are going to narrate today is the story of this transition from the Old English period, the Old English language which looks like a distant foreign language, to the way in which English has become today. And we also know the current status of English is that of a lingua franca which connects different countries. It's an international language. It is not limited to England alone. It has gained a prestige, popularity and an economic importance which was hitherto unknown. And this is the story of the English language that we begin to narrate in this session. If I try to give an outline to this session, let me take you back to the introductory session that we had. We had made it pretty clear in the beginning that this course would be talking about the history of literature and simultaneously narrate the history of English language, because they are both intermittently connected, and there is a way in which language continues to evolve and continues to emerge as part of the literary shifts, literary tendencies, so on and so forth. We also noted at the beginning that Literary history, in fact, talks about the history of not just literary events, but it also has in place non-literary events. It has a linguistic element to it. So, in this session, we will be centrally looking at how language began to evolve from the early times onwards. In that sense, at this point of time, this is also a stock taking of where language is placed before we enter the next phase. So, in a certain way, this is a story of a language from an obscure Germanic dialect to a global language. So, we also noted in the beginning how there were Germanic elements that were built into the language from the beginning because of the earlier invasive tendencies. We will be taking a look at it in detail, and we also noted that the earliest form of English, which is the Old English or the Anglo-Saxon tongue, is almost like a dead foreign language now. So, it becomes all the more curious both intellectually, historically and linguistically to see how such a connection is made possible when we analyze it scientifically from the present. And in the introductory session, we also noted that the only surviving text, Beowulf, is also quite unintelligible to the modern reader unless it is translated into the modern form of English. And this is a story of miraculous survival, because we would know, because of various geographical reasons, because of various historical conquests, there were ups and downs in the story of English. In fact, English makes a comeback, as we also noted, after 200 years of complete neglect and complete abandonment. And for the same reason, from the beginning till the modern times, we note that it is closely connected with the conquests and the socio-religious trajectories that Britain takes from the early times onwards. If we try to linguistically classify English, this is how it goes. English belongs to the Indo-European family of languages. So, in a very broad sense, when we begin to look at the minute ways of classification, it belongs to the Indo-European family of languages, and particularly within the Indo-European group, this belongs to the Germanic group, and this does have historical connections and historical evidences for us to prove it. And also, linguists would tell you that if you break down the language, there are still many Germanic factors which are evidently built into the structure of the language. And this emerged from among the Germanic groups. This the current form of English as we know it, it emerged particularly from the West Germanic dialect. So, in that sense, this is a story of an emergence of a language from a minor dialect towards a global language. So, this is how the Germanic family of languages look like. And we shall not be going into the various details of it. And as we can see over here, the Germanic language has got a northern variety, an eastern variety and a western variety. Both all of those have diverged into different languages, different dialects, so on and so forth. And some of them have a bearing on English language and some of them do not. We do not go into the linguistic details of the same, but what is of interest to us is that English is placed over here. It is a West Germanic language, and this is also a Frisian dialect, is also something we would take a look at when we talk about the various historical invasions which took place. And we would also see that the West Germanic dialect had from the West Germanic dialect, German language also emerges. So, in that sense, we would often find a similarity, especially for Old English with German language, and also we find that some amount of vocabulary, certain kind of sentence structure, so on and so forth, where the things that Old English shared a lot with German. In fact, some of the Old English scholars, they find it particularly important to learn German as well to appreciate the original tongue. And even during Chaucer's time, when language was beginning to evolve, which was in the Middle English period, a certain knowledge of German to understand Chaucer is quite appreciated even in the contemporary. So, this is how the family of languages have been structured linguistically. And if we talk about the historical aspects, this is something that we have already taken a look at. There are these various influences which have come into place. England was quite vulnerable. England was seen as a very fertile land for agriculture. It was a safe place. It was seen as a place where civilization could thrive. So, from the early times onwards, from the BC times onwards, in fact, England was continually cited by various tribes, various various invading groups. So, initially we have the Celts who were inhabiting England, and there is the Roman occupation that follow, and we find the Germanic tribes invading England. Then there are the Vikings, and finally by 1066 the Norman conquest. So, all of these people who arrived. So, all of these communities, all of these tribes, the set of people who arrived in England, they all left a mark of their own language in England. In fact, England, which is why perhaps English language continues to have a strange kind of spelling, a strange kind of pronunciation, some of which completely beats our rationale. So, in that sense, perhaps it's a combination of many different languages and many different influences and dialects which went into the making of this. And as we noted, in order to if we try to sum this up, the reasons for these multiple changes, these multiple influence could be classified into two. This is, we are trying to make it a little simpler. The reasons could be external or internal, and the external factors could be socio-political, economic, geographical, historical. And this also, in fact, as and when different invading tribes came, as and when different kinds of communities began to contribute to the formation of the language, there was also changes in grammar, in sound systems, and this had contributed to some of the external factors for this change, and the internal factors were mostly linguistic. So, we will not be going into the greater details of the linguistic elements, except for some of the very obvious things such as the dropping of the inflections or the great vowel shift that we would be taking a look at a little later. So, if we try to and describe modern English language and break it down into different elements, this is how it would be. There is a strong Latin influence, and also we find Latin vocabulary has found its way into contemporary English, and this is something that we would take a look at a little later in terms of understanding loan words. There is an influence of French language and a group of Germanic languages, Greek, other languages which could be an assortment, and some of those influences are even unidentifiable and untraceable because of the various colonial influences, and these other languages are sometimes quite unidentifiable because there were various things which were contributing, including colonialism, industrial revolution, so on and so forth. And there are also certain names, certain way in which language derived through proper names as well. These details we will take a look at a little later, but this constitution of modern English language as we have it now, this is very important for us to know. English, in fact, has got more foreign influences, as we can see over here, than the native influences. So, in that sense, the peculiarities of English language is quite understandable because it seems to be a victim of a very complicated history and a very complicated invasive pattern as well. So, this reflects the historical and the geographical and the related kinds of non-literary and non-linguistic changes seems to have affected the language more than any of the internal linguistic matters. So, this we need to keep in mind even when we are going through the different phases of historical invasion, because as we can clearly see over here, most of the languages have left behind their influence as and when they traversed to the land of England, whether they attained political superiority or whether they had to undergo a certain kind of decline because of various turn of events. That is a different matter altogether. But what is of supreme interest to us is that they all had left behind their mark quite significantly. And as and when we talk about the various kinds of influences, it is important to note how the influence had begun to reflect itself from the beginning. In fact, we already noted that England had different kinds of influences and different kinds of historical invasions from the beginning. So, even when if we quickly note them again, there were Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, many other Germanic tribes, and also the Normans. So, when all of these different groups of people were invading England at one point or the other, what often gets lost is the fact that the original inhabitants were the Celts. So, when Celts were the original inhabitants, shouldn't we begin talking about the Celtic influence on the language? And this is very interesting. because though the Celts, and some of them interestingly it's also pronounced as Celts, but throughout this course we will be using the pronunciation Celtic. So, even though the Celts were the predominant and the native inhabitants of England, we find them being driven out at a certain point. We have already seen how the historical turn of events had taken place in one of the earlier sessions. But today we shall be looking at what was the Celtic influence that had remained in terms of linguistics, in terms of language. In fact, one interesting thing to be noted over here is that there is very little influence of any of these Celtic languages in contemporary English, in terms of vocabulary, in terms of the language structure, in terms of the internal linguistic elements. There is very little Celtic influence. This is very important for us to note, so that we do not get confused with the other kinds of invasive patterns that we find in language in the upcoming centuries. So, which were the Celtic languages? In fact, though Celtic languages do not have a direct influence or a direct bearing on the way English language is structured today, some of the Celtic languages are still alive, mainly Welsh, which is spoken in Wales, Irish in Ireland, Gaelic spoken in Scotland, and Cornish, a variety of Celtic language. All of these languages, when we compare to English, they also have a minority status. And this information and this little bit of detail, it will be quite useful at a later stage when we talk about the modernist elements and the invasion of modernism in the 19th and early 20th century. In fact, there is a kind of Celtic revival which takes place at a later stage in England, which focuses on these elements which were lost out, the elements which were pushed out or forgotten from English history and also from English language in general. So, this information is quite important for us to try and set the context for our understanding of the Celtic revival at a later point in 19th and 20th centuries. So, though we say that the Celtic influence was very limited in language, some of the words have continued to live on. For example, from Welsh, words such as druid, flannel and bard, they have continued to live into modern English language. And from Irish, there are these words like galore and brog, and from the Gaelic tongue we have words such as clan and whiskey. So, in that sense, though the even when certain kinds of languages have a very limited and a negligible influence on English language, we find that they all had left their mark in some form or the other. Perhaps the amount in which they contributed or the degree of their influence just varies. So, with this understanding, we also move on to take a look at the next phase in the history of English language. So, this is how it all began. There were these Celtic natives who were inhabiting England, and Rome finds it a fertile land for it to occupy, and this is also the time when the Roman Empire could spread its wings across almost the entire globe. So, at this point England is also a part of the Roman Empire. And at this point of time, if we look at the inhabitants over there, they were both Celts and Romans. As we noted, there is very little or negligible influence of the Celtic language, but that is not the case with the Roman influence. Though Rome does not have any kind of political superiority in England when we begin to take a look at the history of England at a later point. So, around this time, Rome had a very significant role to play in contributing to the evolution of English language, though little was known about that at that point of time perhaps. So, in 597 AD, we find that there is a lot of influence of Christianity and literacy. This is the contribution of the Roman Empire. So, we begin to see that the influence and the contribution towards the propagation of Christianity, to the institutionalization of Christianity, and also the beginnings of literacy in Celtic England, that had a far-reaching impact when it came to the contribution to the vocabulary. So that so much so that even after the Celts, the native inhabitants were driven out of England, these kinds of words continued to live on. And we note that there is this fall of Roman Empire that happens a little later. But before that, these words were almost carved in stone, that they continue to be used even in the contemporary. So there is a huge set of words which have been contributed by Christianity, Roman Empire, and the beginnings of literacy during that time. We will quickly take it, some of those words and some of the types of words which began to be used from those times and continue to live on. To make it a little easier for you, let us begin to look at first some of the words related to church. So, words such as priest, altar, cross, mass, bishop, presbyter, cleric, nun, monk, Eucharist, hymn, baptism, demon, angels, paradise. Yeah, I could go on. In fact, all of these words had come from the Roman occupation time. They all had a heavy Latin influence, because Latin was the language of theology during that time. And here we find that most of these words are related to religion, and all of these tendencies, irrespective of what kind of Christianity began to be practiced and what kind of Christianity thrived in England from that time till the modern times, these words have continued to live on. They are now continue to be used as English language and not as part of Latin language. This is a very interesting fact to begin with. And we find that during the Roman times, there was also a significant contribution of not just religious terms and terms related to church. There were also these everyday terms which came to be used quite significantly, terms such as fork, spade, school, rose, circle, paper, and spider. You see, here we can see that some of these words could be related to literacy, school, paper, circle, etc. And words such as fork, spade, rose, they could be related to certain everyday things related to agriculture, related to eating habits, so on and so forth. So, here we begin to see that when a community or when an empire begins to hold a certain kind of authority over England, they leave behind not just their linguistic traits, but there is also something about their way of life that is left behind, which is why linguistic analysis of languages become quite interesting, because it also tells you about the kind of lifestyle that people led at different points of time. The words which have been borrowed from different languages and different cultures also tell you about the kind of lifestyles which were getting borrowed, the kind of eating habits which were getting borrowed. So, this is a linguistic analysis, in fact, is a lot more than a scientific technical analysis. It's also about an analysis of a culture, a way of life, a society, a community living, so on and so forth. So, this is the contribution of Latin tongue, and later when we begin to take a detailed look at different loan words, we will see that Latin had contributed perhaps quite significantly to the making of English language. So, if we go back to see the way language is constituted in the contemporary, Latin forms almost 29% of English vocabulary and English linguistic structure. So, this huge influence dates back to a period which is even before the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, which is a quite significant historical and linguistic fact. So, the next significant milestone is the fall of the Roman Empire. So, the fall of the Roman Empire happens when this is not in fact any kind of a battle, as we had noted in the introductory session. The Roman army and the Roman camp is forced to withdraw from the land of England because they were facing some problems at their own home front. So, the moment the Roman military withdrew, England was left quite vulnerable to different kinds of attacks, and especially these Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons and Jutes, they had they had been keeping an eye on England for a very long time, and we find that all kinds of attacks begin at this point of time. And this is the time when the Anglo-Saxons begin to settle in England. This is the time when England gets its name, the name of its language, and all of that. It's through the contribution of the Angles and Saxons. In fact, whatever happened to the Jutes is another interesting historical question which is not part of this course. It's beyond the scope of our discussion, but the contributions of Angles and Saxons is quite evident in the literature, in culture, in many things that follow. But also, as we noted in the beginning of this lecture, only after the fall of the Anglo-Saxons, only after the Anglo-Saxons lose out to the Normans at a later point, we find that a proper kind of English begins to emerge. In today's session, let me leave you with just this note that English continues to be in a state of flux from the beginning onwards. In that sense, it's very difficult to impose rigidities into the language. So, we know that even from the earlier times onwards, the language is in a state of flux. There are different invasive patterns that are built into the language. There are different communities, different tribes, different empires. All of them have left a mark on the language, so much so that the language continues to be quite absorbent in nature, and hence very difficult to impose rigidities on it. And for the same reason, we also know that unlike many other languages, certain kinds of patterns are entirely absent in English language. In fact, even right from our school days, when we look at certain kinds of development of vocabulary, we know that English has perhaps a lot of exceptions than those words which stick to rules. So, we begin to wind up this lecture with this inherent knowledge that lot of invasions were happening and lot of influences were getting built into the English language, and with the Anglo-Saxons it was a very different ball game altogether. So, in the next session we will continue to take a look at how language continued to develop through all of these influences and how we can trace back these influences from the contemporary times and how this becomes important in the way language is constituted today. So, this is all we have in today's lecture. Thank you for listening and see you in the next lecture.